The sweet scent of sake mixes with the metallic tang of fear. A porcelain cup lies shattered on the silk tatami mats, a moment of imperial rage that has frozen the room in terror. Before the shogun stands his favorite, a young man who minutes before was the most envied person in Japan and is now an inch from death. A recently analyzed entry in an administrative log notes only a minor breach of etiquette. But what could turn a shogun described in records as sickly and physically frail into a figure of such absolute terror? Mainstream history focuses on his political edicts, but it sanitizes the record, erasing the stories of the boys he elevated and destroyed on a whim. How did he maintain this grip? The answer is a terrifying form of psychological conditioning, a weaponization of favor and fear. Keep watching as we expose the mechanism of control he perfected. Because his ultimate act of dominance wasn't violence. It was a command so powerful it transcended life itself, leaving behind a shocking trail of bodies that official histories have never been able to explain. On June 4, 1651, that command found its ultimate expression. In a stark, quiet room in his Edo mansion, a man named Hotta Masamori, one of the most powerful counselors in the entire country, prepared to die. The only sounds were the whisper of his silk garments and the delicate scratch of a brush on paper as he composed his final poem. He was calm, methodical. This was not an act of passion, but the fulfillment of a purpose. When the poem was finished, he carefully set the brush aside, unwrapped the white silk from the hilt of his short sword, and without hesitation plunged it into his own stomach. But his death was not the end of the story. It was just the beginning. As Hotta Masamori's life ebbed away, a synchronized, chilling ritual was being repeated in mansions all across the capital. Abe Shigetsugu, another of the shogun's closest confidants, did the same. In total, more than a dozen of the empire's most powerful men with everything to live for, followed a precise, ritualistic path to self-destruction. The shogun was dead. This wasn't an order he could give. So why? Why would this elite cadre of rulers choose to die in unison? The official records call it junshi, following one's lord in death, the ultimate act of loyalty. But that's the story they want you to hear. The truth is infinitely more disturbing. This was not loyalty. It was the final, horrifying symptom of a decades-long sickness, the endgame of an abusive power so absolute that it reached beyond the grave. To understand how this happened, we first have to understand the man they followed. So, who was this man they followed into the abyss? If you open any official history book, you'll find a portrait of strength. Tokugawa Iemitsu, the third shogun, grandson of the legendary unifier of Japan, Tokugawa Ieyasu. He inherited a nation forged in blood and fire, and his task was to turn a fragile peace into an unbreakable dynasty. And by all official accounts, he succeeded beyond anyone's imagination. He was the architect of an era. It was Iemitsu who slammed the doors of Japan, shut to the rest of the world, instituting the sweeping isolationist policies known as sakoku. He expelled the Portuguese, persecuted Christians, and restricted foreign contact to a single tiny man-made island in Nagasaki Harbor. For over 2 centuries, his vision of an insulated, pure Japan would hold. When a massive peasant uprising, fueled by famine and religious fervor, erupted in Shimabara, Iemitsu's response was swift and annihilating. He unleashed an army of over 125,000 samurai, crushing the rebellion and slaughtering more than 37,000 men, women, and children. It was a message written in blood. His rule was absolute. He perfected the system of Sankin Kotai, forcing every regional lord to spend every other year in the capital, leaving their families behind as permanent hostages. A brilliant political move that shackled the powerful daimyo and solidified the Tokugawa clan's grip on the entire nation. The unifier, the master strategist, the ruthless protector of his realm. This is the man history tells us to remember. But it's a carefully constructed lie, because the official records, the meticulously compiled Tokugawa Jiki, are completely silent about the wave of suicides that followed his death. They are silent about the shattered porcelain cup, silent about the terror in the eyes of his favorites, silent about the nightly summons down those long, dark corridors. To understand what really happened, we have to look at the records they tried to hide, the whispers they couldn't erase. And before we can unmask the monster, we have to understand the world that made him a world with its own deadly rules for love, loyalty, and power. That world had a name for the relationships between men like the Shogun and his young pages. Shudo, the way of the young. And to our modern eyes, it can be hard to understand. This wasn't a hidden subculture. It was a fundamental, celebrated part of the samurai warrior class for centuries. The rules were well established. An older, more experienced samurai, the ninja, would take a younger adolescent, the wakashu. The older man would guide the youth in the arts of war, in politics, in poetry, and in the strict codes of samurai honor. In return, the younger man offered absolute loyalty, devotion, and companionship. An intimate, physical relationship was not only accepted as part of this bond, it was often expected. Treatises were written about its proper conduct, celebrating it as a purer form of love than that between a man and a woman, free from the complications of marriage alliances and procreation. It was seen as a bond forged in the masculine worlds of the battlefield and the court. But you have to strip away any modern ideas of romance or sexuality to see it for what it truly was. This was a system built on a brutal and inescapable foundation of power. For a young samurai from a family of no particular importance, catching the eye of a powerful lord was the only way up. It was the only path to promotion, to wealth, to a future. The loyalty of the wakashu wasn't just an emotional ideal, it was a career necessity. His body, his devotion, his life, they were all currency in a high-stakes game of ambition. In theory, it was a bond of honor. In practice, it was a marketplace. This deeply unequal system was the world Iemitsu grew up in. The practice of Shudo gave him a culturally acceptable framework to pursue his desires. But the rules of mutual respect and honor that were supposed to govern it, he would shatter them completely. He took a system already built on a power imbalance and twisted it into an instrument of absolute terror. And the first to learn this lesson was a young page named Sakabe Gozaemon, a man who discovered that in the shogun's chambers, love and a death sentence were the same thing. That deadly lesson began early, before Iemitsu even officially held the title of shogun. His first significant favorite was a young page named Sakabe Gozaemon. By all accounts, Gozaemon was skilled, handsome, and had captured the intense, obsessive affection of the heir to the most powerful throne in Japan. To be the chosen favorite was to be envied, to be admired, and to have a future paved with gold. It was also, as Gozaemon would discover, to be balanced on the razor's edge of a madman's whim. The story, pieced together from anecdotal court histories that were never meant for public consumption, is chilling in its simplicity. During a private meal, just the young lord and his page, something went wrong. We will never know what it was. A misplaced word? A look that lingered too long? Or perhaps nothing at all? In an instant, Iemitsu's affection curdled into a black rage. He seized a short sword, likely one used for serving food, and lunged across the table at the boy he supposedly cherished. Sakabe Gozaemon was a trained samurai. His reflexes were honed by years of practice. He acted on pure instinct, parrying the clumsy, furious blow. The sound of steel ringing in that quiet room was the sound of his own death knell. In that split second, he faced an impossible choice: allow himself to be murdered, or commit the single most unforgivable crime a samurai could, raising a weapon, even in defense, against his lord. Gozaemon saved his own life, and in doing so, he signed his own death warrant. The rage passed as quickly as it came, replaced by an icy coldness. There was no trial, there was only the shogun's will. The order was given. For the crime of self-preservation, Sakabe Gozaemon was to commit seppuku. He was forced to turn his own blade on himself, to pay the ultimate price for surviving his master's murderous whim. This act set a terrifying precedent. It sent a silent, screaming message through the halls of Edo Castle to every other page, every attendant, every favorite. The shogun's affection was not a shield. It was a spotlight, and at any moment, for any reason, it could transform into an executioner's blade. Gozaemon was the first. He would not be the last. His death was a lesson, and Iemitsu was just beginning to build the institution that would turn this casual cruelty into a perfect, inescapable system of control. That system of control had a physical heart. Edo Castle. At the time, it was the largest fortress on the planet, a sprawling labyrinth of stone walls, moats, and gateways designed to project one simple message: absolute, unassailable power. But the real power wasn't in the outer walls. It was deep within the castle's inner sanctum, a place forbidden to all but a select few. This was the shogun's private world, and it's here that he perfected his architecture of fear. Imagine being led deeper and deeper into this fortress, through checkpoint after checkpoint, until you reach the Obeya, the Great Chamber. It's a vast, opulent space, decorated with the finest art, the floors covered in pristine tatami mats. But it's not a home. It's a gilded cage, and it is filled with hundreds of the most beautiful and well-bred young men in Japan. They are the koshogumi, the shogun's personal pages, and they are all prisoners. They were the sons and heirs of the great daimyo, the regional lords who commanded vast armies and territories. Under the system of sankin kotai, these lords were forced to leave their sons in Edo as attendants to the shogun. It was framed as an honor, but it was a hostage system in disguise. The life of every boy in that room guaranteed the loyalty of a powerful clan back home. Now, picture this. You are 15 years old, ripped from your family, living hundreds of miles away in this silent, perfumed prison. You sleep, eat, and train in this one great room with hundreds of rivals. Every day is a performance. You are constantly watched, judged on your poise, your grace, your looks. You live in a state of perpetual tension, a mixture of suffocating boredom and heart-stopping terror. Because every night, you lie on your futon and listen. You listen for the soft footsteps of a senior chamberlain coming to your section of the room. You pray you don't hear your name called, summoning you for the long, lonely walk down a maze of corridors designed to intimidate and isolate, leading to the shogun's private chambers. It was a prison of luxury, a lottery of life and death, but for every boy who prayed he wouldn't be chosen, there was another who prayed he would. Because if you could survive the shogun's attention, if you could navigate his moods and satisfy his desires, the rewards were beyond imagination. Next, we'll meet the one who played the game better than anyone. A young man named Hotta Masamori, who rose from obscurity to become the most powerful man in Japan and paid the ultimate price. His is the face you must remember, because we saw him in our very first scene, calmly writing his death poem. Before he was a corpse, he was a king. And his story shows us why anyone would willingly step into the shogun's cage. Hotta Masamori did not come from one of the great, legendary samurai clans that had dominated Japan for centuries. He started as just another face in the crowd of pages, another well-bred boy hoping to catch the eye of the master. But he did more than catch Iemitsu's eye. He seemed to capture his very soul. For years, he was the shogun's shadow, his most trusted confidant, and his primary favorite. And the rewards that Iemitsu showered upon him were staggering, a testament to the depth of his obsession. Masamori was rapidly promoted through the rigid government hierarchy, leapfrogging older, more established men until he was appointed Roju, a senior counselor. This placed him in the absolute inner circle, one of a handful of men who effectively ran the country. But the real measure of his success, the one that would have left the other pages breathless with envy, was the land. Iemitsu made him a daimyo, a feudal lord, granting him a domain worth over 100,000 koku. It's a number that sounds abstract to us now, but you have to understand what it meant. 1 koku was the amount of rice calculated to feed one person for 1 year. Hotta Masamori's domain produced enough food to sustain 100,000 people. He was given not just wealth, but a kingdom. He commanded his own castle, his own army of samurai, and held the power of life and death over tens of thousands of souls. From a boy in a crowded room, he became a prince. He was living proof that the ultimate risk came with the ultimate reward. But this golden cage came with a set of invisible, terrifying rules. The favor of the shogun had to be constantly earned, and Iemitsu had a particularly cruel way of testing his favorite's loyalty. Next, we'll reveal the shocking psychological price of Hotta Masamori's success. A price that would push him to the very brink of self-destruction long before he ever drew his final blade. The story is preserved in the unofficial histories, a scene so disturbing it exposes the true nature of Iemitsu's control. Imagine the scene. It is the dead of night, deep within the shogun's private chambers in Edo Castle. The only light is the flicker of an oil lamp. Hotta Masamori is on duty, keeping a silent vigil over his sleeping lord. The most trusted position a retainer could hold. Suddenly, the shogun cries out, thrashing in the grip of a violent nightmare. He wakes up in a cold sweat, disoriented and terrified. Masamori rushes to his side, but Iemitsu is lost in the phantom world of his dream. He looks at his favorite, his eyes wide with fear, and muses aloud, "That was a terrible omen. I feel as if my life is in danger. I wish one of my retainers would die for me, to appease the spirits." It was not an order. It was a whim, a half-conscious utterance from a man still shaking off a bad dream. But for Hotta Masamori, there was no difference. He did not hesitate. He did not ask for clarification. His response was immediate, silent, and absolute. He calmly bowed, drew his wakizashi, his short sword, and prepared to commit seppuku right there on the floor of the shogun's bedroom. He was seconds from ending his own life, not out of despair, but as a simple, logical response to his master's expressed wish. It was only Iemitsu's physical intervention, grabbing his arm at the last moment, that stopped the blade. The shogun had his proof. This is the horrifying reality of what it meant to be Iemitsu's favorite. This wasn't loyalty. It was a form of psychological mutilation. It was the result of years of conditioning, of living on a knife's edge where the line between affection and annihilation was erased. Masamori had been so thoroughly broken, so completely dominated, that his own survival instinct had been surgically replaced by one impulse: to obey the shogun's slightest whim, even if it was a death sentence whispered in a dream. Masamori survived that night. But you have to ask, what part of him was already dead? He was a ghost in his own body, a puppet whose strings were held by a cruel master. And this master was no towering monster of physical strength. The man who held this absolute power was, in person, a deeply strange and fragile figure. Next, we will strip away the propaganda and look at the real Tokugawa Iemitsu. When we picture a tyrant, our minds conjure an image of imposing physical strength, a monster whose body is a weapon in itself. But the man who held absolute power over Japan, the man who inspired such paralyzing terror, was the complete opposite. The official portraits, of course, show the stylized, impassive face of a god-king, devoid of human frailty. This was the image the regime projected, but the reality, pieced together from diplomatic accounts and court whispers, is far more disturbing. Tokugawa Iemitsu was a man in a state of physical decay. He was slight of build, almost delicate. His skin was described as unnaturally pale, and he was frequently ill. As a child, he had survived a severe bout of smallpox, a disease that left his face permanently pockmarked, a constellation of scars on the face of a man meant to be seen as divine. And most tellingly, he had a pronounced, often crippling stutter. Think about that. The man whose single word was law, who could order an execution with a whisper, struggled to form the very sentences that held the power of life and death. Every conversation, every decree was a battle against his own body. This physical frailty, this visible imperfection, is the key to understanding his cruelty. His sadistic power was a grotesque overcompensation for his own profound insecurities. He was a physically unimpressive man who demanded absolute aesthetic perfection from the young men who served him. He was a scarred man who surrounded himself with flawless beauty. He was a stutterer who commanded with the silent, unquestionable authority of a god. The terror he inspired wasn't in spite of his weakness, it was born from it. He wasn't a powerful man who happened to be cruel. He was a weak man whose cruelty was his only source of power. This portrait of a fragile tyrant is the key to understanding everything. It explains the random violence, the psychological games, and the terrifying loyalty tests. And it brings us, inevitably, back to our starting point, the death of the shogun. Because when a god who is this needy, this cruel, and this insecure finally dies, what happens to the disciples he created in his own twisted image? The answer is, they simply cease to exist. They follow him into the dark. We are back where we began. The date is June 4th, 1651. The shogun is dead, and in a silent, perfectly appointed room, his greatest creation, Hotta Masamori, prepares to complete his function. Watch him again, but see him now not as a mystery, but as a ghost. See the man who was conditioned to believe his own life was nothing more than a tool for his master's ego. The calm expression on his face is not the serenity of a noble warrior meeting his end. It is the placid emptiness of a man whose will was amputated decades ago. The hand that writes the death poem is not his own. The arm that draws the blade is not his own. These are the pre-programmed movements of a puppet whose master has just fallen and whose final act is to collapse alongside him. Years earlier, he had drawn this same blade at his master's sleepy, half-conscious whim during the nightmare test. That night, his hand was stayed, but the command was never truly rescinded. It was merely postponed. His life had been forfeit for years, a debt held by a cruel creditor. The death of the shogun was simply the signal to finally pay it. And as Masamori's life spills onto the pristine tatami mats, remember that across the city, over a dozen other men are performing the same, final, empty ritual. This isn't a conspiracy, it's a contagion of the soul. These men were the walking dead, animated only by the neurotic, desperate needs of the fragile tyrant on the throne. When he died, the signal was cut, and all that was left was to fulfill their last programmed purpose. The official histories call this the ultimate act of loyalty. They frame it as a noble sacrifice, the last beautiful act in a life of honorable service. This is the greatest lie of all. It was not a choice. It was the final, twitching reflex of a man who had been hollowed out, psychologically disemboweled, and turned into a vessel for another's ego. The horror is not that he died, but that he had, in every meaningful way, been dead for years. And the final victory of this abusive system? It's how successfully it managed to erase the crime and sell it to the world as an act of virtue. And that lie is a masterpiece of historical propaganda. A victory of the official record over the lived truth. If you go today and read the Tokugawa Jiki, the official history of the shogunate, you will find Hotta Masamori's name mentioned many times. It is a vast, exhaustive, and imposing work of statecraft. In its thousands of pages, you can read the exact date he was promoted to senior counselor. You can find the precise value of the domain he was granted, listed in koku. You can see his name attached to official edicts and policy decisions. You will see the clean, honorable, and sanitized story of a successful courtier, a loyal servant of the state who rose to the highest echelons of power through merit and dedication. But there are things you will not find. You will search in vain for the name Sakabe Gozaimon. You will find no official report of a shattered porcelain cup or a blade drawn in a fit of rage. There is no entry for a shogun's nightmare, no mention of a loyalty test that nearly ended in a bloody death on a bedroom floor. The nightly summons, the institutionalized fear of the obeya, the silent, pervasive terror that was the true currency of Iemitsu's court, all of it is gone, wiped clean from the record. The victims are silenced twice. First by the abuser, and then again by the historian. This is the ultimate power. It is not just the ability to command and control in the present, but the ability to define reality for the future. To erase your crimes so completely that they become whispers, rumors, campfire stories, while the official, sanitized version of you is carved into the stone of history. The shogun's greatest power wasn't his sword, It was his brush. The ability to erase the truth. The question we are left with, island. How many other truths remain buried? Fade to black.